Thank you. What a privilege it is to be here today. I'm very excited. It's my first time at FSU. And here's what I thought we would cover today. So the title is about vouchers, private school vouchers. I thought we would start by surveying the landscape. How broad is this education policy? How many states offer it? How many kids participate? Who are those kids? What do they look like? And then I want to get into some of the literature. So what do we know about participating in a program like this? Direct effects on the students who receive a voucher, or sometimes they're called a scholarship, especially if it's structured as a tax credit scholarship. And then from there, I thought we would move into the indirect effects, so the kids who get left behind, the kids who never use a voucher. Is there any change in their outcomes as a result of a program like this? And then I want to talk about a little bit of the work that I'm doing in North Carolina. I'll take questions throughout, and I'll also have time at the end for questions, so don't hold back if there's something that you want to raise your hand. So here's a map from the EdChoice ABCs of school choice. They do a great job of compiling the descriptive information every year. They keep it very up to date. And this is showing you all the states that have different types of private school choice programs. And the newest generation of these are the pink ones. Those are education savings accounts. And it can be used just like a voucher, which is that a family can take it to a private school and use it to pay tuition. The difference is say you get an ESA for $7,000 and you pick a private school and tuition is $4,000. There's $3,000 still left over in the pot in your allocation. With a voucher, the state just takes that back. With an ESA, the family still has $3,000 to spend on education. So they can use it for testing fees, they can use it for textbooks, they can hire a tutor, they can do some extracurriculars. There's a list of approved ways that you can spend it. So that's a very popular form of school choice, that all of the newer programs tend to look like that. The more traditional ones that we think of when we think of vouchers are those orange dots. I'm based in North Carolina. We've got both types. The difference is that the ESA is for special needs, students with special educational needs, and the voucher is for low-income students. If you live in North Carolina and you have a special educational needs and you're low income, you can get both. And we recently expanded it so that it's universal on paper, although, and I'll go through the eligibility criteria, first preference is given for the lowest income families. So they award them in that priority. As you can see, Florida has a huge tax credit scholarship and ESA, so it's a big up there. I'll show you some statistics unique to Florida in a second. And Arizona is another one that also has a very large ESA, that's that education savings account. Texas being one of the newest additions there, that's going to be one of the bigger programs in a few years too. So all in all, what are we looking at? 34 states, plus Washington, D.C., plus Puerto Rico, have some form of school choice program. That is where there's state funds used to pay for private education. All in all, we're looking at $8.2 billion per year across all of these different programs. That does sound like a very large number, but just to frame it for you, it's about 1.1% of what we spend on public school education, K through 12, per year. The average value of these different types of school choice, ESA, voucher, or tax credit scholarship, are listed here, $7,000, $9,000, $3,000. Again, to put it in context, across the country, average public school spending is about $18,000 per pupil per year right now. So part of how a lot of those programs were passed was by appealing to fiscal conservatives in states to say this is a way to save money. In some cases, those amounts have changed over time. In a state like Florida, it's tied as a percentage of public school funding. So as different ways that the public school per pupil money is awarded and determined what it will be for the year, the voucher will automatically rise the value because it's tied to be a percentage of that. It's usually not an exact match. It's usually not the same as what the student would otherwise get in public school. And there's about 1.5 million students participating in these programs now. So like I said, that overall statistic of about 1.1% of public school spending, that hides some variation by state. So there are choice-rich states where more of the students participate in these types of programs. Florida's at the top there, right? So about 10%, that's what it represents as a total of public spending, of K-12 spending. Right behind Florida at 8%, we have Arizona, Wisconsin, the first voucher program in the country was established in Wisconsin, the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, so that's why that one is up there. It's been established for a long time. Similarly, in Ohio, I'll talk about what we know about the Ohio program because we have lots of good studies of these older programs now that have been around for 20 or more years. And then Indiana, they have a statewide program, so again, it's about 4% of total spending there. So with the early programs, like I said, Milwaukee, that was a highly targeted program when it started. They tended to be targeted, maybe unique to one city before they were expanded statewide. They tended to have eligibility criteria that focused on low-income students. And as a result, the characteristics of who participated in early voucher programs were students who were primarily low-income, low achieving, and most likely to be students of color. So I have some specific examples here of what we know from descriptive studies of these types of programs. So that first one is the Louisiana Scholarship Program, which has been revamped since it was initially created. But at the time, it was a voucher that was very regulated because it was targeted for families who are below a certain income threshold, attending a failing school, and it was about 50% of the value. It was quite low of what would be spent in a similar traditional public school. And this program attracted families where their mean household income was estimated to be $15,000 per year, so very, very low income. There's a great study of Florida by David Figlio that looks at the types of students. So they tracked them in the public school testing database to say, what do we know about the type of pupils that were applying for vouchers? Because there was a lot of discussion at the time about, are they the cream of the crop? Are they, the best students that just wanted to go to private school and wanted the state to pay for it? Or is there more to understand about this? And so they looked at the test score performance of the students relative to all of the students in Florida. So we know that they're coming from low-performing public schools. And then they looked within that school and said, well, okay, it's a low-performing school, but are you the best student in that school? And they, again, were able to plot the distribution to see, oh, these are the lowest-performing students in the lowest-performing schools. So these were students that were looking for another option, right? Things were not going well in terms of their prior academic achievement. Were applying for the private school choice option. And then in terms of the racial makeup of these programs, a lot of the early programs that you see, a lot of the participants were African American. In Louisiana, the state statistics are 45% of public school students in those grade levels are African American, but in the voucher program it was 86%, so 45 versus 86, so massive overrepresentation of certain subgroups. That's no longer true for the most part because the profile of who participates has changed because the programs have changed. A lot more of the programs are universal in their eligibility now, so it's not just limited to below a certain household income, and they're not just limited to a single city. They might be statewide programs. And so, unsurprisingly, they look more like the states now, the overall demographics for the states. The Indiana Choice Scholarship Program, for example, is 64% white now. In North Carolina, our program is now 63% white. And what you also see is that a lot more of the students have prior private school experience. Now, we don't know a ton about this. In North Carolina, I'll talk about some of the research that we've done, but there was a lot in the newspaper about this recently, because the agency that distributes the vouchers, it's an independent agency, it's not part of the state education agency, the Department of Public Instruction, it's separate. They put out descriptive data regularly, and they looked at 1 year prior. So they said, okay, the students that were awarded vouchers this year, what school were they in previously? And it was a very high statistic where previously in private school, it was about 80-something%. And there was huge pushback from the private school community because they said, yeah, because they were receiving other scholarships from the private school, or they had experimented with public and private and homeschool. We have a huge homeschooling population in North Carolina. So they said looking at a snapshot of 1 year prior is not fully informative. So part of the work that we're doing in North Carolina on this parent survey, I think a key insight that we're going to be able to collect is the full history of your child's educational experience. We're really understanding, like, which sectors have you tried? Have you always been a homeschooler? Have you always been a private schooler? Have you dabbled in different sectors? To better understand, because the media tends to run a story that says, oh, they're just subsidizing families that were always attending private school. They were never being paid for in the state before, and that's costing the state a lot more. Something else that comes up a lot as these programs expand their eligibility criteria is who is going to actually move. Because if you make a program wide open, universal eligibility, there are concerns, particularly in rural areas, that this is going to decimate a major employer, that the schools that they are departing will lose funds, because public schools are funded by enrollment counts, right? How many students attend. And so if a lot of students leave at the same time, this would create problems. This could create a spiral that would be hard to recover from. And so it's really good when you get those kind of legitimate concerns to follow them up with data, right? And to actually look at, okay, what has been the experience? What's the take-up rate of all of the kids who are eligible for a voucher program? Who uses it? And there's a great study, Marty Lucan looked at it. For the first year of any voucher program, the average take-up rate is 0.26% of those who are eligible actually apply and use the voucher. And you might say, oh, first year, you know, people haven't heard about it yet. People are cautious, they're risk averse, they're probably waiting until second or third year. And so they look at it over 10 years next, and they say, okay, over the first 10 years of a choice program, what percent of the eligible population ultimately end up enrolling? And it's about 2%, right? And so there's all kinds of reasons that you can imagine. Polling would lead us to believe that many families are satisfied with their traditional public school. They're not looking for an alternative. In some cases, it's by design. The state legislators might have built in some kind of a cap, either by saying we'll accept students up to a certain number or up to a certain dollar value, like we don't want the program to exceed a certain cost until we have budgeted for that over many years. In other cases, and we don't know all of this, again, this is one of the reasons why we're pushing forward with a parent survey in North Carolina. I did some early work where we did focus groups and surveys of parents, and what we learned was that the value of the voucher was set too low. So in North Carolina in the early years, it was about $6,000, and families told us that there's a lot more hidden fees. Like, even if that's enough to cover the tuition, which it isn't always enough, and then I owe a difference, there's other things I hadn't accounted for, like now I'm paying for breakfast, now I'm paying for lunch. Those programs aren't offered in my private school. I used to get a bus, I used to have transportation accounted for. Now I have to pay for that too. There's a uniform, there's textbooks. And so we did some work where we shared those findings with the legislature and just drew their attention to the hidden costs. And we had also learned from speaking with private school principals is that they were not recruiting students to come to their school by way of the voucher program because they thought the value was too low, and they didn't see anywhere in the statute where it would rise over time. So there was a fear, oh, we could take 10 students this year and we're only going to get $6,000 per student. What if we need to increase our tuition 5 years from now, 10 years from now? There's no way for that value to rise over time. So we shared that feedback, and we, in North Carolina, our legislators, they adjusted the program to make it like Florida's, where it's tied to the public school funding. So you have more of a path for the voucher to grow as inflation and other costs cause for all education in all sectors to grow over time. So that helps the private schools gain more confidence in participating. Okay, but so there's a lot of people using them, 1.5 million students. Are they benefiting? Is there any evidence that these are good choices have been made? And I think to answer that question, you need to ask, well, what is it that we would need to know to be able to answer the question, is it working? Are they benefiting? There's that great, it's like a joke, right? So a guy has lost his keys, it's dark, he's outside the pub, and he's looking under a lamplight on the ground, and a police officer comes over. He's like, what are you looking for? He's like, I can't find my house keys. I'm not going to be able to get in when I go home. And he says, all right, well, where did you drop them? He says, over there. So, well, why are you looking here? He says, well, the light is really good here. And that's kind of like, well, we measure test scores because we have test scores, but is that truly what we think is important? I used to work at an ACE school, And when they were training us, this was in Pinellas Park in Florida, they told us, you're preparing these students for college and heaven. It's really hard to measure data on how many of your students got into heaven. Right? So I will show you all of the literature that we have. I just wanted to put that caveat out there. For parents, when they're choosing a school, test scores is not the only thing that they're considering. Right? There's a diverse set of things that they will use to measure whether the school is having a positive or a negative effect. So we do have lots of reliable literature on test scores. I've summarized it here and grouped it by method. So the ones on the top are the experimental studies. They're the gold standard. They're the ones where they used a lottery to assign students to a treatment or control group, and so we know that those two groups are statistically the same, both observable and unobservable ways. The more recent studies of these statewide programs are a weaker research design. They're still excellent studies, but they're quasi-experimental, where the researchers have to get a little bit more creative in identifying an effect, right? And have to do more robustness checks to prove to you, like, this really is a cause and effect story that we're able to analyze here. So we have the most confidence in the experimental studies, and we have reasonable confidence in the quasi-experimental ones. So in the early years of these targeted, citywide, small-ish programs, we had a lot of research from experimental studies showing positive or neutral effects. Yes, Zach?
What are the outcome variables in these models?
Math and reading test scores.
Math and reading test scores.
So even a study that shows null effects is interesting to unpack here, because the voucher might be $3,000 or $4,000 in a world where the comparison group is being funded at $10,000 or $12,000. So students were learning the same in both scenarios. For many people looking at these early programs, they were still counting this as a successful story. Now, a lot of the scholarship, the journalists writing about school choice today will focus on the most recent studies, which is understandable because they're of statewide programs and they are more recent. And in particular, they will talk about Louisiana, Ohio, and Indiana, because they have recent studies that show negative achievement effects. Now, what's interesting here, there's another one in North Carolina where we found positive achievement effects, but it doesn't get discussed as much. But let's just focus on those three, Louisiana, Ohio, and Indiana. What kind of negative effects are we talking about here? So test scores going down, and here's how it tends to be characterized. This is a recent Substack entry by Chad Alderman. He says, the research literature from recent large-scale voucher programs finds negative effects on achievement scores, even while showing positive impacts on other outcomes. Would you accept that? Public investment, lower math scores. So this has spurred a lot of discussion about, is this something to be concerned about? Is this something that we need to learn more about? And so there's lots of good follow-up research that needs to be done to understand this, unpack this a little bit more. Like in Indiana, why are they only observing negative test scores in math but not English language arts? And also, what is it about the role of program design about Louisiana's program that looks very different from a lot of other programs in other states? It was targeted to low-income students coming from failing public schools, offering a low-value voucher. Is there something about program design that could be influencing the types of private schools that will accept a voucher? So an example of one way researchers can dig into this a little bit more and understand it better, they looked at all of the private schools in Louisiana, and they tracked their posted tuition for 10 years before they actually the program existed. And they could identify a set of schools that was in, let's call it, financial distress, because their tuition keeps going down, right? The cost of nothing is going down over time. If you're slashing your tuition year after year, it's because you are having trouble recruiting students, right? There's an enrollment problem. So these are private schools that were struggling for some reason or another. Those were the types of schools that were signing up to participate in the Opportunity Scholarship Program, in the Louisiana Scholarship Program. So that was a signal that they weren't attracting the highest quality, most successful private schools. Another thing to keep in mind always as we're weighing the evidence is to lean on the most rigorous research designs. So of those three, I would put the most weight on the Louisiana study because it was an experimental study that used random assignment. And then also, I had mentioned this previously, but how much is the value? How much money are we talking about here? At the time of those studies in Indiana and Louisiana, the value of what the private schools were getting to educate those students was about half of what the state funding was in public schools. Also, we have data on 3 states. That's great to have those studies. What about the 31 other states that have similar programs, right? So states that are able to do this type of analysis are different from states that aren't. And one of the ways in which they're different is that they've imposed a lot of regulations and rules on the private schools. For example, you have to take the state test. Well, if you're in a private school using a curriculum that is not aligned with the state course of study, the state standards, there's no report card coming from the state where there's a letter grade, there's no reason or motivation or stigma to do well on the test, that's a very different environment than a public school against which you're being compared. So there's some selection bias in the states that we're able to understand this in. Another thing that's important is that we have evidence, I'm going to get to, the indirect effects of competitive effects, responses by traditional public schools that are losing students to a voucher program, improving their offerings, doing better, students performing better. And so you're now judging the effect of a voucher versus a traditional public school that's also improving over time. But I think the key thing here, the insight that researchers have landed on, is that maybe test scores aren't the only outcome that we should consider. Maybe it would be more informative to determine if a school is successful by looking at how many kids graduate, enroll in college, finish a college degree. That's ultimately what's going to affect their trajectory and earnings in adulthood and things like that. So let's talk about what evidence we have on the long-run effects of choice. I see James smirking. This is my daughter when she was 5, but she's 8 now. But I just like the picture because of the steps. So the outcomes we can look at are graduating from high school, compare the kids who received a voucher versus those who just missed it, rolling in college, and then finishing your college degree. Right? Those are meaningful outcomes. And what we have is evidence that students who participated in one of these programs saw significantly higher high school graduation rates. And these are large effects. In Washington, D.C., the control group graduated high school at a rate of 70%. The students that received vouchers, 91%. So that's a 21-point advantage. In Milwaukee, we see a 7-point advantage. And then you might say, there's all kinds of stories that you might offer to say, well, maybe they had lower standards for graduation. Maybe it's easier to graduate from a private school. So let's look further. Let's look further afield into the child's trajectory and see, does any college see value in their high school preparation? Were they admitted? Are they enrolled into college? And here we have lots of evidence, okay? Milwaukee, 6 percentage point advantage. New York City, 6 points. Florida, 6 points. Washington, D.C. and Louisiana, no results, no effects. Ohio, this is the most recent one. 15-point advantage. Ohio, are you remembering a few slides ago? Ohio was in bright red as showing negative test score effects. These kids are going to college at a rate of 15 points higher than they otherwise would have. So there's all kinds to be learned, all kinds of things to be learned here about what measurement are we using. Is the state test the right metric to compare learning on? Or are there other ways that we can measure success? And then you might say, okay, sure, they're getting into college, but are they flunking out after a year or two? Are they actually finishing these degrees? That's what really counts. We don't want them saddled with debt and no degree. And so we have further evidence. Florida, 1 or 2 percentage point advantage in actually succeeding in earning that degree. Ohio, 9 percentage point advantage of actually attaining the degree. That's a very large effect for something that's so difficult to budge, a statistic that's so difficult to budge. Now, there's lots of nuance here, of course. There's some interesting work. This is a Chang and Peterson study where they looked at students in New York City, and they further divided the voucher students into severely disadvantaged and moderately disadvantaged. And they had a theory that they explain about if you're struggling so much, it's almost like the ladder has fewer rungs. Like you're facing challenges in housing insecurity, and there's not groceries at home, and there's only so much we can expect schools to compensate for and to overcome. And so is it really reasonable that we would expect to see a benefit for severely disadvantaged students? And this was backed up by their findings. And so they say, well, for those on the higher level here, this graphic kind of explains it, but where there's more rungs, the moderately disadvantaged students, they saw their college enrollment rates increase by about 15% and four-year degree attainment increased by 50%. No effects for those at the bottom of the rung there, the severely disadvantaged students. So there's a lot to be learned there, right? Maybe we should, if I'm a policymaker looking at that, maybe we should do a better job of creating a sliding scale for the vouchers where there's more funding for the students from the lowest income families, and taper off from there, because clearly some students need greater support than others. So indirect effects. We've talked a lot about the 1.5 million students, but there's more like 55 other million students that are in the education system. Are they potentially harmed in any kind of way by the existence of such programs? And there's a great Figlio and Hart and Carbonic study that uses the Florida data where the program is older, right? So they start in 2002 and they track them for 12 years, and they say the program grew, it expanded fourfold over that time. As it was expanding, what was happening in the traditional public schools that were exposed to competition from the choice program. And they looked at a variety of outcomes. But you can see if we just combine the math and reading together, because there's not much difference between them, so those green dots, you can see that public school students who never used a voucher, never attended a voucher program, saw an increase in their test scores as the program expanded in areas that had higher competition from private schools relative to areas that did not have high competition from private schools. So this is a direct response to your students having another option. It's like, oh, we're in a marketplace now. We've got to change our offerings. We've got to change how we think about tutoring, staffing, all kinds of ways that schools can change and respond. You might say, well, test scores are not the only outcome we care about. What about suspensions and absences? Those two things went down over time. And this is across the entire state. There have been other competitive effect studies. In Florida altogether, there's been 10 of those. All of those show positive effects on traditional public schools. In Milwaukee, there have been 6 competitive effect studies. None of them have shown a negative effect. Some have shown no result, and some have shown small positive effects. In DC, 1 study of null effects. In Ohio, 3 studies, all showing a positive effect. That's vote counting, when you just describe the studies like that and just count this many had a positive effect, this many had a negative effect. A more rigorous way to summarize all those studies would be to do a meta-analysis. And there's a study by Horia Jabbar summarized here. And I just have a quote from it where our results, they pulled all of the data into one model and reran it, accounting for the standard errors as they should be by state. And they say, well, what's the overall effect of a voucher program, a choice program, on public school achievement? Our results suggest competition from private school choice through voucher policies can have significant positive impacts on overall student achievement. All right, so it seems like there's not a negative effect on public school achievement. That's my daughter again and her little friend. What are the effects on other outcomes, though, right? What if families use the voucher to, like after Brown versus Board, what if they use it as a way to exit a public school and go to a private school where all the students look the same? Right? That would be concerning from a public policy standpoint. So that's something we could measure and we can track. What are the effects on school-level racial integration? And there have been a number of studies on this. I was co-author on the one in Louisiana. And the biggest insight that I can offer you on this literature is that traditional public schools are already highly segregated because they reflect the neighborhoods. And residential neighborhoods are highly segregated. And so the voucher was actually a way to break the relationship between where you live and where you go to school. And so it was a way to actually improve racial mixing for the students, right? So they were moving to private schools that otherwise would have been outside of their reach. So let me take you to North Carolina and focus in here. Our voucher program when it started, it was only worth $4,200. That's gone up since then, but not across the board. We have a sliding scale now. I'll show you the income cutoffs for that. But it's been around since 2013, and there's two ways it's grown. One is by increasing the number of seats available, like so the participation cap, and increasing the associated funding to allow that to happen. And then changing who's eligible, right? So making it a universal program. A universality was achieved in pretty recently, October 2023, where it says any family, regardless of income, is eligible to apply. And then they had 10,000 kids on the waiting list. I think it was 55,000 students on the waiting list because they made it universal and everybody wanted to use it. So then the other way they expanded it most recently, November 2024, where they drastically increased the funding. So this is what the funding and the student participation looks like over time. The blue bars are the number of students. So we hit a milestone in January of this year where we crossed over 100,000 students. That makes it the largest voucher program in the country now. And then the associated funding is approaching $600 million per year, but it's written into legislation that it can grow to 900 within a couple of years. So very, very big program. Like I said, it used to be worth $4,200, no matter who you were, where you were coming from, what private school you were going to. They've changed it. So if you're from a household where your annual income falls below $57,000 now, your voucher is $7,468. But if you're from a higher income family, the most you can get would be $3,300, right? And so you can see here some quotes from our politicians reacting to it. So welfare for the wealthiest families is one example. A reckless waste of taxpayer money is what our governor said at the time. And then a lot of the discussion about why they made it universal was focusing on the middle class. And so there's a quote from one of our state representatives. This bill is about giving the middle class meaningful access to school choice. And so you can, again, when you see claims like this, is it welfare for the wealthiest families? You can dig into the data a little bit and understand that and actually test it out against, what data are collected. And so this is a nice graph showing the counties that use the vouchers the most, what's the median family income? Because all of the conversation is, it's the wealthiest counties. It's Raleigh and it's Charlotte. Those are the families using the vouchers. And so what you see is that on this bottom axis, this horizontal axis, this is median family income at the county level, right? So poor counties here, rich counties here. And then this is the participation rate in the program per 1,000 children living in the county. And so what you see is it's downward sloping, meaning there's most participation among the lowest income counties. That's what that sliding scale design does, right? It gives higher weight, higher priority to families from lower income. They get more of a voucher and they get first priority when they're being awarded. So this is a progressive design. So we've contributed a number of reports as the program has grown to better understand those. I put the Go link to find those if you're interested in unpacking any of them. Several of them became journal articles, like this most recent one, a competitive effects study, found small, mostly neutral effects, null effects on traditional public schools. Some small positive effects, but nothing large. But in this past fall, we were asked to work with the legislature to answer a research question they had, because once we crossed over to 100,000 and we were approaching 100,000 students this fall, there was a lot of op-eds, a lot of blog posts about this unaccountable program. There's no transparency. We don't know if we're wasting taxpayer money. And so the legislature asked, well, what would it take to answer this question? And they gave us 3 tasks. They said, recommend a test, not the state test, because they're looking at Louisiana and Indiana and Ohio, and there was negative effects, negative effects, negative effects, and people said, it's because you made them take the state test, right? They're not following the state curriculum. They're not going to perform well on the state test. So they said, recommend a neutral, nationally normed test that we could use, that we could make 3rd and 8th grade in public and private schools take. Public and private. There's already a lot of tests given in public schools. And right away, red flags are going off. We're like, you want us to recommend a test that the public school kids who never applied for a voucher get nothing in return, that they're going to have to sit for? They don't benefit from these results. It's not used to inform their instruction. Like, Nobody is going to want to do that. So, and then they also said, and also, by the way, tell us how feasible it would be if North Carolina devised its own new test, a brand new version of the ITBS or the Stanford test, but it would be ours. It would be different from our current state test because it would be through grade, like where you beginning, middle, and end of year, where you would take it multiple times. So in our head, we're like, that's so expensive. Like, you're talking millions of dollars to develop a test. But yes, we will put all this in our report and tell you what's feasible and what's not. And to start this process, we're going to do a listening tour. So we met with the state superintendent. We met with the superintendents of the largest school districts. And we said, do you know that they're asking us to recommend a test for your kids, your 3rd and 8th grade kids to take? Would you be fine with that? They're like, get this in your report. Testing burden is real. This is a real concern. We met with the private school lobbyists. We met with the Catholic school associations. We met with everybody that would meet with us, all of the House reps that were interested in education, on the Senate side too, both parties. We had 75 stakeholder meetings, and we gathered all of this input. And part of what we did was we said, let's just show them what other states are doing. Like, North Carolina doesn't exist in a vacuum. Other states have more than 100,000 kids in a voucher program. What do they do for testing? And Florida was helpful in this regard. So if you weren't aware, this is what the FLDOE website says are the approved nationally normed assessments. It's a long list, right? It's 28. If you ask me, I've worked in education for a long time, list how many nationally normed tests do you know? It would take a long time to get to 28, right? Because there's a couple that dominate. Terra Nova, the Stanford one, and the Iowa, they're sort of the big hitters. But Florida has a very generous list. And it says right there on the website, if your preferred test is not on the list, let us know, let's talk. Submit some criteria and we'll review it and consider adding it to the list. So that's one approach. Other states obviously have the opposite end of the spectrum. They say you take the state test. If you're going to get state money, you take the state test. And so we presented the whole landscape to them. And what else we did, so we had all these stakeholder meetings, things came up. Like, we learned, hey, public schools in North Carolina, they already give nationally normed tests. We were like, what are you talking about? They're like, oh, it's a district level decision, and they can use them for all kinds of things, like, for example, gifted and talented screening. All right, so I live in Wake County. Everybody in Wake County takes the COGAT. My daughter's in 2nd grade. She took it last week. And then if you do well on the COGAT, they follow up and they give you another one. I think they give the Iowa in that test. So we documented for the legislature, just so you know, these are the tests that are currently used in the public schools that are nationally normed that you said you're interested in. And by the way, these are the most common ones in the private schools. Whether or not they participate in the voucher program, these are the tests they're using. And we cut it off at some point. We said you have to have 5 or more schools participating in it to make the list, because it's got a long tail. There's a whole long list of tests you've never heard of before. So this is helpful. We were hoping there might be some overlap, like, oh, look, both sectors already take one test. That's the one we'll recommend. No, there's no overlap. Of course not. So we recommended that if you want to limit the testing options that the private schools can take, you should designate a list. And it's up to you, legislature, because you guys are elected, to determine what's the criteria to make it on the list. But they had given us some starting criteria, so we made the table and said these are the ones that meet those criteria. Similar to Florida's approach, right? But while we were creating that list for them, we also suggested, hey, we did this stakeholder listening tour. We met with 75 people. Very few of them were parents. We would love to hear from parents. What would parents value in a test? So we've pitched them on this parent survey. We've done one before. We can do it again ourselves. But when you have support from the state to do it, you'll be much more successful in getting a higher response rate. So we're pushing forward with the parent survey to hear from parents what they would value in an accountability model. And then we're also saying, by the way, we'll also give you a supplementary report free of charge of all the different ways you could study the program and the long-term outcomes, college attainment, what would it take to measure that? Looking at the national literature to say, what are the things we care about and we have measures of now that you might consider, right? So this is like part of the job of being a researcher, is working with the legislature and nudging them to say, if you wanted to learn more, here's how you would do it. So this is the list we gave. 3 tests rose to the top. based on the criteria they had given us at the outset. But you might decide that there's criterion missing, or that you don't value some of these criteria the same way. So we also included these are the other ones that meet some of the criteria that you might include if you value X over Y. So we gave them a list. Parent survey. Like I said, we had done it previously. From the previous one, these are the types of questions we asked, the kinds of insights that we thought families could offer. Why are you using a voucher? What is it that you value about it? Do you perceive your school to be high quality or not? What information do you use to make that assessment? And then building on some of the previous work where we had found out that the value was too low and that there were barriers, we're following up, checking back in. The value has increased. Is that better for you now? Are you still facing other barriers? So I'll share some of the findings from that first, briefly, just that first iteration. We at the end of the survey, we asked all kinds of demographic characteristics, and one of the things we asked was their political affiliation. And most pick one of the two major parties. Some choose no affiliation. That was an option too. And then we just tabulated their results based on their political affiliation to see if that's a way that families differ. And more than any other characteristic that we looked at, that's absolutely a way that families differ. So parents who report that they identify as Democrats, when they say what they are valuing as a reason to apply for a voucher, they say, well, my prior school, my traditional public school, was not academically enriching enough. So I'm seeking something better on that criterion. And this didn't change. We asked multiple cohorts. This graph is showing you Democrats in 2020, Democrats in 2023. On the other hand, Republicans said, it's all about religion for me. My prior school does not offer religious instruction. I'm seeking that, and that doesn't change over time either. So these are enduring. These are correlated with other characteristics of families. So as we're redesigning it, if you have ideas, I would love to hear your advice about what are we not asking parents that we need to know. We plan to focus on this accountability part. What's your perspective? Would it be important to you that the private school is accredited or some other quality assurance mechanism the state could offer? Do you care about that? What about reporting? Should there be a report card or some kind of data dashboard for private schools that would help you choose? And then we also want to ask the public school parents, what's your satisfaction level? Are you interested in a voucher? No? Okay, why not? Tell us why. And part of the motivation for this is to understand, because the public school system recognizes now 100,000 students are using vouchers. Oh, we're in a competitive environment. We're launching a PR campaign called Find Your Fit, Build Your Future. They're doing this 6-week thing. We're in the middle of the 6 weeks right now, where they're going around the state and celebrating magnet school, early college, other forms of public school choice. So we've suggested to them, wouldn't it be helpful to survey the parents and ask them about the things they value or things that would improve their experience? And we're hopeful to do cross-state comparisons and compare parents in different choice-rich states to understand their motivations. Okay, I've talked a lot. Happy to take your questions.
All right, don't be shy. Just curious, did you find any within-party racial differences and the reasons that they chose? Were there differences, distribution of responses different for white Democrats and black Democrats?
I'm not sure we had the sample size to do it, and I don't recall, but I can check. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Do you look at any long-term impacts of non-educational things like employment rates after graduation or poverty or health outcomes?
Yes. She asked if we looked at longer-term outcomes like employment and poverty rates. I agree with you that college data is excellent, but not everybody goes to college, and there's other ways that we can judge success, and having income data would be awesome. And so we are having lots of conversations, but it's early days for our state. We're building, not I, but the state is building a longitudinal data system that will link the tax records to the educational records. So then we could look and see, earnings at age 25 for kids who attended school with a voucher versus those who didn't. So it's definitely on our radar as something that would be important to study. And it's not like it would be the first time to use that kind of outcome. There's a really impactful study by Raj Chetty and colleagues where they looked at earnings in their mid-20s, probability of a teenage pregnancy, probability of incarceration, and then the neighborhoods that they live in. You can look at the income of all the neighbors and get a sense of the median income of the surrounding community that you live in. All different ways to judge life outcomes. So, on our radar.
So, well, first I apologize for missing a lot you're talking about. I said this, I had to administer an exam. But the last part, I'm curious, whenever you go to look at these preferences between voucher and non-vouchers, have you looked, or do you think it might be worth looking at homeownership status? Because, I'm thinking if there's a home voter hypothesis out there, maybe homeowners have a different, some people say homeowners don't want school choice.
Yes.
Because of equalized home values. But just putting it out there as an idea, any thoughts about that?
Yes, and there is a literature, and I think it uses Florida data, where they can show that the quality of the surrounding public schools affects the home values. And there's also national data where they ask families, did you choose your neighborhood because of the public schools it gave you access to? And it's a very high percentage that say yes. So I think these are important things to track. I do think there's likely a relationship there. There's lots of school choice in the United States. There always has been. It's just been very indirect. It's been tied through home ownership.
And I wonder if somehow it would interact with partisan idea or a sense of equality, like value on equality maybe. So just curious. I don't have the answers. So.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting to probe. Yep.
Relatedly, I'd be curious, you asked parents about their perceptions of school quality. What did they use to get those perceptions? Like, are they using niche?
Yeah.
Like, weighs niche users' reviews of the schools higher than any quantitative data point collected by the state? Are they using the state report cards of local schools?
Mm-hmm.
Are they using their own experiences, talking to their neighbors? I'd be very curious about where those come from. And I think it ties into the community context.
I agree with all of that. And it also reminds me, one of the demographic questions we asked at the end of the survey was, oh, by the way, do you work in a public school? Because that gives you a different insight and lens to understanding, do you value the report card? And last time that we did the survey, we could see, oh, you were previously a teacher or a coach or a private school principal. So yes, we plan to ask all of those things. What do they use? It seems from sort of initial piloting and just discussions with people, it varies quite a lot. And I visited and I liked the vibe. It can be as simple as it felt right. And that's really hard to quantify, but important to document. I think, yeah.
Does the grade that a student starts to go to a private school on their voucher, like with a voucher, affect the benefits of their experience?
Yes. So the Florida data by Chingos and colleagues, where they were looking at college outcomes, they grouped the kids into those who had spent at least 4 years in a private school with a voucher versus those who had fewer than 4 years. Much larger effects for those who had been in private school with a voucher for a longer time.
I'm curious about the response of the public schools to the growth in private schools. So there were a bunch of reports there that suggested that the public schools performed better in the presence of a private school competitor. What's the mechanism by which that occurs? I mean, what are they doing that's different to improve their offerings, however it's defined?
I think for the most part, it's not perceived as much of a threat in terms of, well, we're the only school around, and that is changing when, especially in rural areas, when virtual learning becomes an option, like a virtual private school or a hybrid homeschooling environment. The types of ways a public school might respond to an enrollment threat is staffing changes if they have the autonomy to do it. And some of them do. Like in North Carolina, they have restart schools where if you are a persistently low-performing public school, you're given charter-like flexibility, which means you get to hire and fire teachers in ways that you otherwise wouldn't. And you get other flexibility over things like your calendar and your textbook decisions and things like that. Other ways, changing, the staffing is huge. I mean, I think that's a big one. Changing curriculum, changing course offerings, there's lots of ways. I mean, and maybe that should be part of our questions, is what are you doing to address?
Yeah, so a follow-up to that is, are there any states then that are looking at the public school reaction, seeing that those responses have been effective and getting out in front of it? So, figure like New York or Illinois, which is not friendly to school choice, have they revised any of their options to reflect the successes in those public schools?
I think not in direct response, like they wouldn't draw a distinction quite so clearly. And it's also conflated with other things that public schools are responding to, like we're responding to absenteeism crisis after COVID. And so the types of steps that different states are taking are hugely context dependent. The Economist on Valentine's Day ran a really interesting story about Birmingham, Alabama, and the really outside the box things they're doing. Like they had, the city was encouraging attendance by running a lottery where they'll pay your rent for a month. This is for public school parents. If their kid had perfect attendance, you get put in a lottery where the city's going to pay your rent and utilities, I think, also. So this was like a mayor-led initiative. I can send you the article, it's fascinating. So I think that there's space for sort of very localized solutions.
So the response by public schools to increasing vouchers, was the response by public schools, like the benefit of it, more disproportionately to higher income areas where those public schools are, or is it like equal across the board?
The competitive effects literature is very small effects. I don't think it has been parsed by wealth in the surrounding neighborhood. It's a good suggestion. Yeah.
I wasn't here for much of the discussion, so I have no idea if you touched on this at all. But is there any internationally, if you can look at any different places around the world, in Europe, in South America, anywhere where they're using school choice in a way that's alike the United States, and if it's working in different places? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so Ashley Berner has a nice book on this where she writes about pluralism in other countries and why that's the magic sauce that sort of is what we should be seeking, and why, the idea is that it's not like McDonald's, right? McDonald's wants to open a new Tallahassee branch. It's going to look exactly like the one that's in Tampa and Orlando, right? That's not true for schooling. It's something that's so personalized, customized to be truly effective. It cannot look like the McDonald's model. And so Ashley's whole argument is that a pluralist system will have all kinds of schools, and some of them go to school for 4 days a week, and some of them are religious, and you need it all, right? You need the diversity. So she has a book, I can definitely send you the title, where she draws on examples from Belgium and other European countries that have had sort of intentionally developed pluralist versions of this. It's interesting, so I'm from Ireland, right? And so we technically have universal school choice. Like, you can go to any school, they're all privately run and publicly funded. Nobody is paying tuition, with maybe one or two exceptions of some elite boarding schools. But they're 95% Catholic, so it's not pluralist. So it's interesting to see, it's sort of context specific by country. It's certainly evolving, because Ireland is not 95% Catholic anymore. Yeah.
So you are in the #1 state for school choice right now. If you walk into our Department of Education, we have banners hanging and celebrating school choice here. But there are growing questions and concerns from some corners. There are always opponents to school choice, but there are questions about testing, about are we wasting money, are we spending it effectively? Like there's lots of pressure to, even when programs are in place, to regulate them. And so I guess I'm going to ask you to prognosticate, to look forward at the school choice landscape. What do you foresee happening? Are more states going to expand choice programs? Are the states that have programs like yours going to implement more regulations and testing requirements? Like, where do you see this going?
Yeah, I think that regulation is probably a one-way ratchet. You never remove regulations. So a lot of these programs are designed very light touch to start. I think it's inevitable that changes. So yes, I anticipate more regulations. Like, our recommendation was to narrow the list of nationally normed tests. Like, we only had 3 in the top part that meets all the criteria. Florida's allowing 28. Sounds like I'm proposing more regulations. in North Carolina. So I do anticipate more regulations. I do anticipate more scandals. Like there's misuse of funds in every sector of the public policy. But it will, as these programs grow, it's inevitable that there will be something in the newspapers about misuse of funds, which like also happens on the public school side too. Don't get me wrong, it's not like there's never scandals there too. But I think the central insight that's been helpful for me to think about it is that every time you add another student to one of these programs, you're adding a family that has a new right that they don't want to give up. And they have brothers and cousins and sons, and they're all aware, like, wow, he gets to go to that school. That was previously out of reach. That's a constituency that previously wasn't there before. So I don't think it's in any world likely that these programs get canceled or ended, even when administrations change. And like, I'm in a purple state, you know, sometimes we have the Republicans in charge, sometimes we have the Democrats in charge, but I don't think it's possible to take back once you've given this type of program to families.
Maybe one more question?
Especially when you talk about like the longer time you're in private school, the higher yields you have.
Yeah.
So is it really that they're exposed to more quality instruction, or is it that they're exposed to more resources, connections, they know the right people, they understand the systems that are working, and like how to apply to college? You know, maybe these are the people who are first gen who wouldn't have these anyway.
Yeah. These are great questions, and it was part of like the original founding philosophy of the KIPP charter schools, where they were teaching these sort of intangible, hidden middle-class values of how you get ahead in education and life. So it certainly could be a part of it. From a strictly psychometric stance, it may also just be like the test is, the fourth grade test is asking you about fractions, and your private school doesn't get to that till April, and the test is given in February, right? It really could just be that it's totally out of sync with the curriculum sequence that's being used in a private school. There are also different types of tests, like the state tests are criterion referenced. Like there's a set of goals, and we're going to measure whether you achieved that goal. But the nationally norm tests, they're norm referenced, right? So it's a totally different testing tool. So the measurement part of it is quite complex. And one other thing too, the conditions. So like in Louisiana, they said, oh, if you get the Louisiana scholarship, you have to take the state test. And the private school was like, well, we already give some other tests. So you're just going to take those 5 kids, and on a Monday, like put them in another room and give them the state test. That's a very different testing environment. Like no one else in your school is taking it. Like what's being communicated to you about the value of this test? So there's all kinds of differences, I think, but we need to keep exploring and learning more.
So on that point, do you have you looked at data on like SAT scores, like for get into college? Do they have higher? I mean, maybe they're not performing or performing slightly worse on the state standardized tests, but I'm wondering, do you just have another outcome like college admissions tests?
Yeah, I think that would be a great outcome to look at. I don't have those data, but it would be great.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.